Iran is not going to surrender. Obviously, the United States is not going to surrender. So as long as that is the goal and the method is coercion, we're just going to see more destabilization of war. And ultimately, at least in the short run, it tends to backfire more on Trump than on the Iranians.
Now the objective is, how do we get the strait open? They said it was temporary. They kept repeating this thing Donald Trump says, which is the rest of the world needs the oil more than America needs it. Here we are, we're helping you, we're going to get it open for a bit. But by the way, after that, it is over to you in Europe.
Is there anyone, as far as you know, who's whispering truth to Trump power?
Hello and welcome to TrumpWorld. I'm Anushka Asthana in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Matt Frei in London. And Anushka, I've got a couple of questions for you to start off with. I mean, it seems as if we're at yet another inflection point in this war that is dragging on and on and on because of Project Freedom, because of the fact that, there are reports of economic pain finally being imposed on Iran by the American blockade. And of course, the world economy is yet again watching all this from behind the sofa. Buttocks clenched, things are not going very well at all. The German Chancellor's having a miserable time. Our government here is having a terrible time. There was an open row between Rachel Reeves and Scott Bessent last week in Washington during the IMF meetings. So we seem to be at a point where things have to move either forwards or backwards. How do you see the situation?
Well, I have just been watching Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, give one of his briefings from inside the Pentagon. I mean, it does feel like something is happening because we did see a bit of a change in tone from him. I quite often go to those briefings, although I'm slightly giving up on it because I think the questions are very planned out and it's not really a totally open, free press conference.
You put your hand up and just get tired. I remember when I was in the White House with Bush, I always put my hand up, and by the end I had repetitive strain syndrome because I never got called upon to ask a question. It was very, very boring. Or you just sit there and observe, hoping that Pete will shine his light on you.
Don't get me wrong, actually, watching and observing at that close quarter is really fascinating. But they do literally put your name on a seat in a place where they know he's not going to ask a question. So yeah. But it was interesting because I thought his tone was less aggressive than usual. They were talking about Project Freedom, which is their attempt to get ships going through the Strait of Hormuz. He said it was a temporary thing. He said it was a defensive thing. I mean, even in the very name itself, which, normally historically Americans always call military operations things more like freedom. But recently we've had Operation Epic Fury.
Midnight Hammer. Yeah.
Midnight Hammer, other much more aggressive thing. Let's just start by having a quick listen to Pete Hegseth this morning.
Project Freedom is defensive in nature, focused in scope, and temporary in duration, with one mission: protecting innocent commercial shipping from Iranian aggression. American forces won't need to enter Iranian waters or airspace. It's not necessary. We're not looking for a fight, but Iran also cannot be allowed to block innocent countries and their goods from an international waterway.
What I thought was really interesting in there was an acknowledgement by them, I think, for the first time, by both Pete Hegseth and Dan Kane, that Iran has had the ability to hold the global economy hostage. They said that's unacceptable, but they admitted that that was what had happened. And actually, at one point, they were asked about the kind of sequencing of all of this, why the military stuff had come first, when Dan Kane in the room had argued that the blockade was actually the most successful thing that they were able to do. And he basically said, well, that's a political decision, the sequencing of it, but our original objectives were different to our objectives now, is what they effectively admitted, which was now the objective is, how do we get the strait open? They said it was temporary in as much as they kept repeating this thing Donald Trump says, which is the rest of the world needs the oil more than America needs it. And so here we are, we're helping you, we're going to get it open for a bit. But by the way, after that, it is over to you in Europe. And I've sat in that room and heard them many times be really critical of Europe. Pete Hegseth has talked about the fancy conferences that the Europeans are doing and suggesting that it's never led to actual action. And Matt, just explain to us why it is that we've got to the position where they need Project Freedom.
Well, Project Freedom, which essentially means opening up the strait, not completely, but partially, for the passage of some, but not all of the 2,000 ships that have been marooned there for, since February the 28th. They're doing it, I think, in order to prove to the world, essentially, even though they say they don't need the oil that comes through there, they're doing it to prove to the world that they have the upper hand in this conflict. And so what is so strange about this is they've got a lot of firepower in place. They've got 3 aircraft carrier groups, 25,000 troops, including Marines, on various vessels. And remember, about a month and a half ago, we wondered if these troops would be there to actually occupy one of the islands, like Kharg Island, the oil terminal, or maybe even strips of the Iranian coastline. And their potential task has been really pared down to that of escorting a number of ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, when they started doing that, of course, the Iranians said, you can't do that without us giving you, the AOK, the green light. They went ahead with it anyway. There's some confusion about how many ships got through and how many ships got hit by the Iranians, but the Iranians definitely, fired on at least one vessel and also exchanged fire with an American vessel. And it looked as if this could go, horribly south, and we could be back to where we were before the ceasefire. It is interesting that that has not happened. So even though there's a lot of bluster, and for instance, the Americans also took out 6 of these speedboats. The Iranians say they were just civilian speedboats. I can't imagine any civilians using their speedboats in the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans say, no, they're part of the so-called mosquito fleet of little boats that harass the tankers, etc. But the fact that this did not immediately explode into something bigger shows me that there's an element of restraint there on both sides, with both sides claiming the upper hand, both sides saying that they're resolved to stick it out. And and that may well be the case. What I find so fascinating is that once again, the rest of the world, which has been called upon to help open the Strait of Hormuz, is sitting there like deer in the headlights, because their economic plans are being shredded on a week-by-week basis. I spoke to the governor of the Bank of England last week, who more or less said we may have to raise interest rates 2 or 3 times this year when we're supposed to lower them. We could have inflation at 6 to 7%. None of this was supposed to happen. The German chancellor is in a terrible position because his economy is now, their growth forecast has been reduced to 0.5%. This was supposed to be the year in which all these economies who were in the doldrums were supposed to come out of those doldrums and finally start growing again. And all that has been upended by this war. And those governments, and Starmer will find out, at the end of this week, there are other reasons there, of course, as well, but he will find out to what extent this war has created real political pain at the ballot box. And I think this is something, like so much else in this war of choice, that is, there's put the cat amongst pigeons. I mean, all these alliances are being refought and redefined and rearranged. So suddenly you've got Israel getting on really well with UAE. They did sort of anyway with the Abraham Accord, but here's Israel supplying the Iron Dome to the United Arab Emirates to help them protect themselves against the Iranians. You've got the Pakistanis involved. You've got China sitting on the sidelines, both helping Iran, but at the same time trying to sort of sound a little bit like an honest broker. It's fascinating to what extent this war continues to rearrange just about everything, on the diplomatic sphere. And the one thing that people aren't talking about in the White House, unless you correct me if I'm wrong, is regime change. They're not even talking about the nuclear program much anymore. So it's all become a war of necessity about this one narrow strip of water.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, they do still try to say repeatedly that the original objective and the main objective is to try to limit the nuclear ambitions of Iran. And in fact, on that, Pete Hegseth's interestingly kind of been open about something that everyone thought, but they hadn't admitted so openly as he had, both today, but also when he was in front of senators and representatives last week, which was they did believe that the nuclear facilities had been obliterated last June. And the reason for going in now was because of nuclear ambitions, not because that had restarted. And I thought it was interesting to see him admit to both of those things. On that point of the economic impact on the world and why the Strait of Hormuz has become the absolute centre of all of this, it was so interesting when our Chancellor Rachel Reeves was over here in Washington, D.C., speaking to like senior British government sources here. I mean, first of all, the fury from her, which I have never seen a minister hit out quite like she did at the Americans. But secondly, someone behind the scenes was saying, we are all the incumbent governments across Europe and across the world are going to get COVID-style backlashes as a result of this. Now, it's all very well for the Americans to say, the oil's your problem, not our problem. It turns out it is their problem because oil prices are set globally. And so even if America can produce its own oil, which it can, this is all affecting the prices at the petrol pump. I think petrol is $1 higher than it was a year ago, over $4.40 now. Diesel's up $2. So it is a massive problem for Trump. I mean, again, they were talking today in the Pentagon about trying to get peace talks going. But you can see the difficulty of it. They admitted that those small Iranian boats have very little actual military equipment on them. There are people there with guns. And through that, they've been able to cause this level of economic damage, which is why the Americans are reacting now so, forcefully to that one point. In terms of peace talks, they felt like they were starting, then they weren't starting. There's been no move to send anyone. Pakistan are obviously still trying very hard. But at the same time, I was talking to people here inside Congress who I know are in Donald Trump's ear, and they're saying to me, we do not believe talks can work in any shape or form. One person was saying to me, we just need to absolutely, obliterate Kharg Island and get out of there. And that's the sort of thing he's also hearing on one side of the fence here.
I think it all gets back to the original sin of this conflict, which was a conflict of choice launched by the Americans and the Israelis together. Now, as I've said before, the Israelis have a very clear logic in this. And Netanyahu has been very open in the last few days, actually, saying this is unfinished business for us, right? We need regime change. We're not seeing that. So doing a deal with these people is not going to work for Tel Aviv in the long term. And that might mean that the Israelis reserve the right to get involved again militarily at some stage in the future. And then the question is, does America, follow them? And Hexworth was at such pains today to point out that actually it's the Americans calling the shots, not the Israelis. And I think that is a problem that will not go away. But again, remember this, it started with 15 different reasons. They were making them up every 5 minutes of why they launched this war. So if you have a conflict that the American public does not see the overwhelming logic of, they don't see why this war should happen, then it's down to the effects of the war. You're measuring everything against the actual tangible consequences that this conflict is having. And if you're paying twice as much at the pump as you were before, and meanwhile, you've got a president who's obsessed with building a 90,000 square foot ballroom and a triumphant Arc de Trump, somewhere in Washington, I think ultimately that will be Trump's Achilles heel. And it could be manifested as soon as in the midterm elections. This combination of, snubbing your nose at the affordability crisis that ordinary Americans are going through, a war of your choice that doesn't seem to make any sense to the rest of the country, that is making their lives even more difficult. Meanwhile, spending a ton of money on projects that look like vanity projects that are kind of your branding culture gone bonkers, right? Everything's got a Trump name, whether it's an aircraft carrier or Trump's face and signature on the, dollar bills or the triumphant arch. I mean, he's always been a branding guy. We knew that because everything that he put up in New York was a Trump tower. But even so, this is going to new levels. And I wonder what you think. I mean, is this his Achilles heel and the Republicans' Achilles heel in the midterm elections?
I mean, I definitely think it's massively problematic. I think, we talked a bit about it last week, but we had a focus group done by Public First that I listened to. And just the first caveat to just put in place, lots of Republican voters still love Trump. His kind of MAGA base, as you would call it, absolutely love him. Only 4% are unhappy with him at the moment. That said, to win a country, you need the independents who have shifted heavily away from Trump. And you need the softer Republicans who are also more likely to say they're not happy with what's going on. And I think there are a few things that stuck out to me as the things they're not happy about. The first is that the economy is dominating on every front. People are really feeling the pinch. So if the economic situation is not sorted out, that affects him. The second was even his biggest supporters really don't like the way that Donald Trump talks. They sort of say, we like what he's doing, but we just don't like the way he's saying it and the way he's going about it. And I think the kind of putting his legacy down physically across Washington, D.C., across the country, into the dollar bill, the thing he's trying to do more than anything, fits into that category of it's just a bit unseemly for people. They don't really like it. And you know, I just don't think they have successfully made the argument when it comes to the Iran war. I mean, the thing obviously looming ahead of us is the visit to China. Just tell me what you make of the situation in terms of the American relationship with China and China's relationship with Iran right now.
I will do that in a second, but you've got to answer this question first, Anushka. Who do you think is actually whispering in Trump's ear, if anyone at all, saying, you know what, Mr. President, that meme of you as Jesus, not a great idea, or you as kind of a Gothic warrior straight out of the Valkyrie on the White House social feed, not a great idea. Is there anyone, as far as you know, who's telling, you know, who's talking, whispering truth to Trump power?
Well, I was chatting very recently to people who had worked with Donald Trump in the first term, and I sort of asked them this question, and obviously they're no longer working with him, so they might have this opinion. But I think their view was that in the first term, one by one, there tended to be someone who was willing to say, this isn't okay. So I said, well, what about Susie Wiles, the chief of staff? And they felt that she sees her position as basically helping him to achieve what he wants to achieve. That doesn't mean, by the way, that she isn't thinking about the midterms. We know that she spent a lot of time holed up with Republican strategists in, you know, hotel rooms around Washington, D.C., having conversations about the midterms. They know that things are difficult. They know that the war has gone down badly and that the economic situation is a massive problem for them. They are trying to shift him in that direction. But I definitely think there is a lot less control, attempting to pull him down, attempting to make him stop saying things. It's much more of a let Trump be Trump administration than the first time round. The second group of people who are in his ear are the people who are one step away, the senators, the commentators. And you know, I listened to a very long interview, but very interesting one with Tucker Carlson, who was obviously a huge kind of MAGA, Trump supporting influencer on the right who has turned very strongly against him because of the Iran war. But I thought there was a couple of things that were really interesting. In the run up to the war, it was very clear that Trump was having repeated conversations with people like Tucker Carlson on the one side, but also, you know, the equivalent of him on the other side, who people like Mark Levin, who obviously had more influence than he had on this particular occasion. And it's kind of incredible to think that that level of influence is also coming in from the inside. I've spoken to senators who've been like on the phone to him that morning as well. And so he's listening to all these people. But ultimately, I think it's very hard for anyone to control what he's doing.
Well, as he's told the New York Times at the beginning of the year, my conscience is my voice, my inner voice. I live, you know, I feel it in my bones, all this instinctive stuff that has always been part of his, you know, trademark politics. Anyway, you asked me a question about China. I think China, you know, China yet again, you know, ever since Trump got back into office, they must have been alarmed during that second inauguration speech when he talked about hemispheric control, etc. Alarmed and not so alarmed. Alarmed because they suddenly thought, okay, this guy's flexing his muscles a way that he didn't do before. Less alarmed because if they thought that he was going to be occupied with the Western Hemisphere, then surely he'll leave us alone in the Eastern Hemisphere. And then, of course, the alarm got worse and worse with Liberation Day and the trade tariffs that were announced. But the Chinese are also, if anything has happened this year with the China-America relationship, it is China realizing just how much power it has and realizing what the limitations of American power look like. So first there was the trade war, which China definitely won because they leveraged the access to rare earth minerals, you know, in their interest and against America. It's a little bit like their version of the Strait of Hormuz and, you know, and using a kind of toll to say, you don't get through this unless you pay us. And it was that leverage that brought the trade war over to China's side. And then you've got this summit that is taking place, in theory, still on the calendar, next week. Now, this summit was supposed to happen in April. It was postponed after the beginning of the Iran war because Trump realized it would look really bad to go to China in the middle of a hot war that was still very much being fought at the time, upending markets and all the rest of it. And now, you know, he asked for a second date in May, obviously thinking that everything would be resolved by then, which it isn't. So to postpone the summit a second time would be highly embarrassing. And this meeting with Xi Jinping is one of the absolute kind of key calendar moments of the second Trump administration. He has said so publicly over and over again. So postponing it again doesn't really work. But going to China, going to Beijing, when the Strait of Hormuz is still, a chokehold on the world economy, thanks to a rump regime that should have been obliterated by now, according to Trump, is also incredibly embarrassing. And then there's China's role in this. I mean, China and Iran have pretty close ties. Iran is part of China's Belt and Road project and has been for years. The Chinese have offered through the Pakistanis, the Iranians, a land import-export route so that, Chinese medicines and various other things can flow into Iran. And Iranian oil and steel and various other exports, dates, for instance, can flow to China. So they are facilitating an Iranian workaround the various economic blockades that are going on right now. And at the same time, of course, crucially, they're supplying some of the technology that allows Iranian drones to fly into buildings in the UAE or indeed in Israel, or into American bases. So what does Trump tell the Chinese? What does he tell his friend Xi Jinping? To back off or else? I can't imagine him doing that. So watch the Chinese in the next few weeks. I mean, they had their own fears and their own domestic issues, mainly around their economy. But again, they come out of this conflict looking like not just winners, but the kind of wise, designated drivers of planet Earth, right? I mean, you've got Europeans having to make up their mind. What's better, to be with erratic Uncle Sam or the steely embrace of Uncle Xi? Not very pleasant, but at least we know where he's coming from and we kind of know where he's going.
And on that note, I think it's a good time to bring in our guest. Before I do, I just want to mention an acronym that he uses a few times when we spoke to him, JCPOA, which we also talk about quite a lot, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is also known as Barack Obama's Iran deal, the nuclear deal from 2015, in which there were a lifting of some sanctions for Iran in return for a promise not to enrich uranium beyond a certain point. The deal that Trump, of course, ripped up. We talk about that with Trita Parsi, who is the former president of the National Iranian American Council and now at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Have a listen to our conversation with him.
Trita Parsi, thank you very much for coming on the program. I mean, we're now into, I don't know what day it is, but this thing has been dragging on for such a long time. It does feel as if, though, this could be quite an important week because of Operation Freedom, the kind of the clash of the two blockades, if you like. Where do you see this conflict at the moment?
Well, I think the first thing I would note is that according to the administration and according to the different groups and entities that supported this idea of a blockade, Iran should have crumbled about 11 days ago, and it hasn't. And we are now hearing reporting, which is not surprising at all. It's already been going on for some time, but it was in the Wall Street Journal today that Trump is now frustrated that the Iranians have not caved as a result of this blockade. Zoom back and you will remember that earlier on, he was also frustrated that Iran had not caved simply by the military threats that the United States had issued back in January. And this is a pattern that we see in which Trump is pursuing coercive strategies with the goal of achieving Iran's surrender. Neither of those components work. You're not going to be able to achieve anything particularly coercively, particularly after the way this war has gone and with the leverage that the Iranians now have gained through that war. But also, surrender was never in the cards. Iran is not going to surrender. Obviously, the United States is not going to surrender. So as long as that is the goal and the method is coercion, we're just going to see more destabilization of war. And ultimately, at least in the short run, it tends to backfire more on Trump than on the Iranians.
But the Iranians are losing a lot of money, aren't they? I mean, they must be losing hundreds of millions of dollars in income a week from the oil that they're not selling, from the steel that they're not exporting. And even though there's a kind of land route across Pakistan that's been opened up more, surely that doesn't compensate for what they've lost in the Strait of Hormuz.
Not at all. They are definitely suffering, but that is the same pattern that we've seen before. All of the previous sanctions also imposed a significant cost on the Iranians. All of them were effective in terms of making life more difficult for the Iranian economy, for the average Iranian, as well as for the government. However, the success of these measures is not based on the measurement of pain it inflicts. It's whether the pain is translated into a change of policy. And this has not changed the Iranians' policy, nor has any of the previous sanctions done so. The only time the United States has managed to get a significant national security shift on the Iranian side is through diplomacy and through the exchange of concessions. And that was in the JCPOA.
Can you explain that a bit further? You know, Donald Trump is obviously looking at this. It's maybe a word that's not always used to describe him, but he was thinking about it in a rational way, that causing this amount of pain would eventually lead to some form of surrender. But that was not the right type of thinking for this Iranian regime. Can you explain why there never comes a point of surrender?
Well, there's several different reasons for it. First of all, some of these questions are of national security, existential characteristic for the Iranians. In which you're not going to see those type of surrender. I mean, you saw concessions from them in the JCPOA, but you're not going to see surrender. But there's also a different element here that is really important to understand. Trump is approaching Iran as if it is a regular Middle Eastern dictatorship run by a family or one person. And if you manage to really squeeze that person, you know, whether it's Saddam or Gaddafi, surrender is in the cards. This is not what Iran is. Iran is not a democracy by any stretch of the imagination. It is an authoritarian state, but it has a system that is not dependent on any one single individual. It's based on numerous institutions. And in order to get any major decisions from them, you would have to actually manage that system. And this is what happened in the JCPOA. It was rather hard, making sure that you got the majority of the system to be in favor of this. The majority of the system will never be in favor of surrender. It simply will be the end of the Islamic Republic. It would be suicide. And I told the administration before this war that they're making a huge mistake thinking that the Iranians fear war more than they fear surrender. They fear surrender far, far more than they feared war.
But you're talking obviously about the structures that run Iran, and we'll come back to Project Freedom, I'm sure. But just on the kind of broader point, which is the Iranian population and the desires of the Iranian population, we get to a point, and no one is saying what was the right way to get there, but the Iran deal that you're talking about with Barack Obama didn't help the Iranian people, did it, in the same way as they were looking for, or a lot of them are looking for? Is there any kind of system, technique, that can happen that can actually lead to more freedom for Iranian people?
I actually think that is not entirely accurate. The Iran deal did not end up favoring the Iranian people in the manner that it could have had it been remaining in place. But it was, Trump walked out of it after less than 2 years. And as a result, the type of measures that would have benefited the Iranian people never really came in. But let's see what happened in those 2 first years. The Iranian economy grew between 6 and 7% within the first 2 years of the JCPOA. Had it been left in place by now, we would have had it for 11 years. And if Iran's economy obviously would have slowed down a little bit, but if it had continued to grow as a result of these sanctions lifting, undoubtedly the Iranian middle class would have grown much stronger. And its position vis-a-vis the state would have actually grown significantly stronger. Instead, we had the opposite. Trump walked out of the deal. The Iranian economy started to crumble and shrink. The Iranian middle class was decimated. 1/3 of the middle class between 2018 and 2019 went into poverty as a result of these sanctions. That is a far worse way of treating the Iranian people than the JCPOA was. Had the JCPOA been left in place, we would have a very different scenario. I personally think the Iranian people would have been out on the streets protesting again for greater political freedoms, but they would be protesting from a position of strength rather than from a position of despair, which is the result of leaving the JCPOA.
Of course, they were out on the streets in the beginning of the year, the end of last year, because of the economic problems, caused partly by sanctions, but also by a legacy of mismanagement and so on. I just wonder, at what stage do the people become more dangerous for the regime that is still clinging on to power? When they're really squeezed, as they, I'm sure, are now, by a combination of war and, terrible economic privations, or are they more dangerous for the regime once they've, once the reins have been loosened a little bit and they feel a bit more comfortable, which would have involved, sanctions being lifted in the past, which obviously wasn't the case. When do the people become most powerful in terms of getting rid of the regime?
What we have seen in other countries, and I think the same pattern is repeated in Iran, is that when economic situations really get very bad, it does increase the tendency of protest, which is totally logical and understandable. It does at the same time tend to decrease the successfulness of these protests, which is a very critical thing. You have more protests, but they're actually not achieving much. Whereas if you had them taking place during periods in which the middle class actually is strong, and the middle class is the backbone of the democracy movement in Iran, just as much as it has been in almost every other country. We have very few cases in which we have seen a country being subject to the type of embargo style sanctions that Iran has and transition to democracy as a result. In fact, there's only one example, and that is South Africa. In all of the other cases, when we have this level of sanctions on a country, it tends to make the state stronger vis-a-vis the society. Society grows much, much weaker, and the state tends to become more repressive internally. And in addition, it tends to become more aggressive externally. That's the track record in most of these cases. Again, only one situation in which we can see an embargo-style sanctions regime leading to democracy, and that was the very unique circumstances of South Africa.
So if we continue your logic then, does this mean that a perpetual war with the West, with America and Israel and perhaps others who might get involved eventually, and whether it's a ceasefire or actually a hot war, but this perpetual state of siege, including all the sanctions and all the other privations linked to it, actually helps the regime and they're absolutely fine with that?
No, it leads to the strengthening of the worst elements within that regime, not the regime as a whole. We have seen a dramatic radicalization of the regime and much more hardening of the regime as a result of these wars and the sanctions, etc. The reform movement in Iran that had significant amount of support, I mean, we saw massive numbers participating in the elections, was completely discredited as a result of the fact that Trump walked out of the JCPOA and then Joe Biden did not walk back into the JCPOA. The reform movement had put all of its eggs in the basket of saying, we can resolve the economic situation in Iran if we resolve the tensions with the United States. They struck a compromise, and yet the United States walked out of the deal. And this really destroyed the credibility of the reform movement, which at this point essentially is increasingly a non-factor. Those who took over are the much more hardline elements. And we saw, of course, how Raisi became president and later on died in that crash. But what we're seeing again is that these type of policies, just as much as this war, tends to favor the hawks within that regime.
So can I ask you back on Project Freedom, which we're obviously seeing at the moment, or as they've named it, from Operation Epic Fury to Project Freedom. I thought it was interesting listening to the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and then Dan Kane running the military operation next to him, basically admit that their objectives have had to change because they have seen the power of the Iranians to be able to hold the global economy hostage. I mean, just two things on that. It's not acceptable, is it, for the Iranians or for the Americans or for for Oman to try and take an international waterway and use it for leverage. Where do you see this heading next?
First of all, I agree with you in general that, again, there's some murkiness on the legality of all of this. And I'm not an international lawyer to be able to say exactly whether what they're doing is permissible or not. There's some arguments in favor of it, plenty of arguments against. But we should also remember that we're now in a context in which international law is increasingly set aside, not just by the United States, but by Europe as well. The German chancellor said that the international law apparently does not apply to Iran. Well, if it doesn't apply to Iran, in the case of war, then it also doesn't apply to Iran when the Iranians are taking control of the Strait of Hormuz. So we have to kind of choose which one it is that we want. And I think Europe's performance here is really problematic and counterproductive to Europe's own long-term interests. Europe has traditionally been one of the strongest supporters of international law, and seeing that being eroded as it has in the last couple of years is devastating for global security overall. So just as part of the context, I think that's very important to understand.
Just on that, what are your, because Europe, I mean, obviously there have been comments here supporting what the United States is doing, but Europe overall has obviously not joined this in an offensive nature, or certainly not the UK. Do you, and the argument our Prime Minister would make would be partly because they don't believe in things that, don't pass international legal standards, but you just don't see it like that. What are the kind of most egregious examples of Europe standing against international law, in your opinion?
Well, in this specific context, I think we should also compare it to what Europe did in 2003. Of course, not the UK at that time, but rest of Europe, who firmly stood against the illegal invasion of Iraq, forced the matter to the Security Council, paid the price for it, but were proven absolutely right with the position that they've taken. That Europe is only seen today in essentially Spain and one or two more countries. So yes, the UK did not join in. It did reference international law, but it's not at all the same level of opposition that we saw from the rest of Europe back in 2003. And I think this is partly because of the fact that Europe as a whole unfortunately has chosen to become more and more dependent on the United States, in which its maneuverability in these situations is much more limited than what it was before. And again, it's ultimately bad for Europe. It's bad for global stability. And from my perspective, it's bad for the United States. The United States needs a strong European ally that every once in a while can tell us, that's not a good idea. Perhaps you shouldn't do that, because we tend to have a lot of bad ideas over here. And as of late, it's been more and more of those. So we need a Europe that can actually be that type of a friend. But a Europe that is so dependent on the United States has lost its ability to stand up and tell us when we're about to do something that is not in our own interest.
Well, Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, did sort of stand up in front of school kids and is now paying the price in lots of ways that I'm sure he hadn't imagined. And he's getting a lot of flack for it domestically from German politicians, including in his own party, when he probably made those points in order to score political points with a home crowd.
It's highly problematic for Merz to first support the war, say that Israel is doing Europe's dirty work for it, say that the international law does not apply to Iran. And then when the war goes badly, put the responsibility at the feet of Trump, as if Germany itself did not play a role in helping facilitate this. Remember, he was in the Oval Office during the first couple of days of the war and just nodding along. So,
and he got complimented by Trump, who said, I like you much more than Keir Starmer, more or less.
Exactly. So, is it good for Germany to stand up? Yes, but not in this manner. Not first supporting it and then pretending as if he has no responsibility.
But guess what? It's the German car lobby, the petrol heads that run the German economy, who said to him, what on earth are you doing? You can't possibly be critical of Trump, because if this thing goes on and on and on and we have to pay the price, which they did with 25% tariffs on EU cars, which is primarily aimed at Germany, then, he loses out big time, and he's not exactly riding high in the popularity stakes. I just want to move on from Germany to China briefly. I mean, the Chinese, at the beginning of all this war, we thought the Chinese would be in a vulnerable position because of the amount of energy they import through the Strait of Hormuz, but actually partly because of their reserves and other things, they've been playing quite a smart game. The Iranian foreign minister is there this week, and guess who's going next week? Donald J. Trump.
Yeah, I would watch this space a lot. I do think that the Chinese have played a role in this war that goes beyond what we have been able to detect. And that they have, without having their fingerprints on it, without them necessarily being offensively active in this war, have nevertheless contributed to it in manners. And there's a coordination between the Iranians and the Chinese that obviously is very important. Again, it is no coincidence that the Iranian foreign minister is there right before the summit. If it goes forward, as you know, it was already delayed once as a result of this war. It will be embarrassing for Trump to show up in Beijing, still having to deal with this war, still having not succeeded in putting an end to it.
More embarrassing than cancelling it? I mean, cancelling it would be even worse, wouldn't it? Surely?
It certainly would be. I'm not saying that he has any good options, which is precisely why he shouldn't have started this war in the first place. It tends to create these situations in which you just have to choose between bad options. And when it comes to China, that is the case. For the US, when it comes to the war itself, it's the case.
Thank you very, very much for your time. We really appreciate having you on.
Thank you so much for having it. Really, really appreciate it.
That was Trita Parsi. Very interesting take on all of this. In particular, the idea that had the Obama deal remained in place, perhaps the opposition within Iran would have got stronger over the years. Next week, Matt, I think we'll be talking about China, won't we?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think all eyes will be on China. Even here, on the island They'll be on the election results, significant for everyone on the upside and the downside. But the big geopolitical moment, arguably, of the whole second Trump administration so far will be this meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. What they will say to each other, how much of it we will know about, whether they come out, both of them feeling like winners, even if any one of them is. That's it from TrumpWorld, from me in London.
And from me in Washington, D.C. See you next week.
See you next week.